In the last video, we created our Go blog that just takes a Markdown file and it renders the just plain text version of the Markdown as part of the web response whenever somebody tries to visit a blog post. So what I want to focus on now is actually turning this into a more useful blog. And by that, I mean, we're going to start taking that Markdown and we're going to start generating HTML out of it. And then we're going to start making everything look good. So we want to make sure that there's HTML for each blog post. We want to start adding some styling so that the whole page looks decent. And we want to have a nav bar that lets us go to different pages. So we're just going to focus on things that will allow us to render each blog post, but render it within the context of a bigger layout. So like just sort of a page with nav bars and stuff, and just so it looks good. So we're going to start with generating Markdown. And before I do that, I'm actually going to create a second blog post. This is just going to say goes.io.reader, and it's just going to say goes.io.reader is defined as, then have a little Go snippet. The reason I'm doing this is because our first blog post, I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. Our first blog post doesn't have any code in it, which was fine for just setting something up and seeing if it worked. But I write most of my blog posts with code snippets, and they're all technical content for the most part. So because of that, it makes sense for me to go ahead and at least have one example so that I can see how that works. Make sure these code snippets are going to look good. Make sure that if I want syntax highlighting or anything else, that it's going to be there. So I want to go ahead and just have that there. And long term, I'd probably start adding in a bunch of blog posts and make sure that they all look decent, that whatever styling I'm using looks good for long form blog posts versus short ones. But this is a good enough starting point. All right, so now that I have this, I'm going to go ahead and just start our server, main.go, and I just want to sort of make sure that this is all working. You'll see here that if I refresh the page, I'm getting how to boil eggs. It's just a plain text version. io-reader is just going to render this. It's clearly not doing any HTML or anything else, and that's where I expected it to be. So I'm going to stop the server, and I've done some of this. I tried to record this video once, and unfortunately my audio didn't record, so I'm here recording it again. So if you see some of the tabs open, that's why they're all open. So what I'm going to do is I want to first take this Markdown and I want to start generating HTML. And then I'll just sort of render that HTML to the page, and that should give us at least something decent looking. And then from there, I can start doing things like adding syntax highlighting to the code and doing all this other stuff. So I opted to use the Goldmark library whenever I was doing the HTML rendering. So this is just a library. It's got 3,500 stars. So a decent number of people have all starred it and like it. It allows us to take Markdown and convert it into HTML that we can then render. It also has the ability to add extensions, which I really liked because when I write in Markdown, it's very common for me to add custom Markdown syntax. Let me go ahead and just show you. It would look like this. This is the title of the aside. This is some extra side content that is relevant, but not necessary to enjoy the blog post. So I'll often write things like this, and I don't always put the spaces there. And the reason for this is that I often write technical content where it might make sense to link to another blog post or another article or another reference in case they don't understand something inside of the blog post, but it doesn't make sense to stop and explain that directly inside of that blog post. An example of that, just from one of my courses, this is from a paid course, but inside of my courses page, you'll see here that I have a page that's talking about an HTTP handler function. And inside this, we go through and talk about sort of why we're doing different things. And we talk about interfaces. Well, this is part of my web development course. And I can't always guarantee that everybody at this point really understands Go interfaces, especially if they're coming from another language where interfaces either don't really exist or they're just very different. So this blue part here is an aside, and it basically just says that if you want to read more about interfaces, you can check out the following free resource. And sometimes these asides will have a lot more information. Other times it's just a link to something that they might want to check out, but it's something that I find myself doing one in every maybe 5 posts. So I like to have the ability to add it there. And the fact that Goldmark allows me to just do it from the get-go is pretty awesome. So I like having that as an option. I don't actually know how easy it is to extend it, so it might not actually be that easy to do, but it's an option, and I want that to be something that I can explore in the future. The other reason why I like Goldmark is just because it has extensions for things like syntax highlighting already built in. It's used by enough people that I know it's pretty well tested. All this stuff means that it's probably going to work pretty well for what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and just install Goldmark first. So if I pull up the page where Goldmark is, you'll see here that there's an install command. So I'm going to go ahead and just do go get. There's a $sign at the front I don't want. And then after I go get it, I want to get some code that allows me to convert some source code into a bytes.buffer. So let's go ahead and go to our post or our main.go and go to our post handler. And I'm going to go ahead down here and I'm going to go ahead and say, I want to convert the post markdown into a buffer. And then I want to copy everything from the buffer into my response writer. This is going to give me an error. So the main, actually, I'm going to go ahead and change two things. Take this line. I don't like putting the error inside of the same line that the if statement's in, just because I feel like it sometimes makes it a little bit more annoying to deal with. So I'm going to go ahead and just split this up. But you'll see here that this is giving me an error because of the post markdown. And that's because when we call sl.read, this here returns a string. So because it's returning a string and this convert function actually wants a byte slice, I need to convert this string into a byte slice. Luckily in Go, a byte slice and a string are basically like a string's underlying type is a byte slice. So I can just convert a byte slice into a string using this here for syntax. So I'm just going to do that real quick. And that should make this code work for us. So at this point, we should actually be able to restart the server and see HTML instead of just plain Markdown. And that wasn't really a whole lot of code. It was just basically just calling this convert function inside of Goldmark. So let's go ahead and do go run main.go. And let's bring up this IO reader. Ooh, okay, there we go. You'll see here that my aside bit is just being rendered as weird plain text. That's because it doesn't really know how to handle it, and that's fine. But you'll see up here that we actually have this code. If we look at the HTML, it's actually being stuck inside of a pre, and inside of that there's a code, and this is all being rendered how we'd want it to be rendered. We've got HTML here. I can also go to the other page that we had, and it's how to boil eggs, and this is also being rendered. The steps, we didn't actually like set those up as like list items or anything, so they're not being rendered the best, but you know, they are there, and nothing's really wrong. This is just how Markdown works. So now that we have all of that HTML being rendered, let's go ahead and take I guess the next step, and that's going to be adding syntax highlighting. And I like to start with syntax highlighting just because it's something that's just really important for the type of content I write. And I already know Goldmark has an extension for it, so it's a good way to sort of experiment more with this library that we just installed and just started using. So what we're going to use is the extension called, it's Goldmark-highlighting. I'm going to go ahead and just bring up the GitHub page. The way this library was designed is things like Goldmark highlighting is in a separate, I guess, package that you would install, and then you would go ahead and tell it to build Goldmark using this extra extension. And it was designed this way so that you could have extensions that aren't necessarily inside of the Goldmark source code that some other person might have written, but you can still use it within Goldmark. And then they just wrote their own extensions that same way. You'll notice here there's not a lot of stars for this project, and I think a huge reason for that is that anybody who's using Goldmark, if they're going to use this here Goldmark highlighting extension, they probably didn't star this one as well. They probably just went ahead and grabbed it and just assumed that the same person wrote both. So I'm not really too worried about the lack of, tons of people using it. I'm guessing it's being used more than is expected. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Let's go ahead and go back to our terminal. I'm going to do go get and install this. And then we want to go ahead and use it in here. So before I start to use it, I'm actually going to add the import for it. And the reason I'm adding the import is that historically, for whatever reason, I feel like this one has not auto-imported correctly. And I think it's because of the V2 and just, I don't know, maybe I have something set up weird with my VS Code. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in there for the time being. And to make this work, what we're going to do is we're going to come down here to our post handler, and we're going to update our post handler a little bit. I currently have it set up so that it is using Goldmark.convert, which is just sort of a global function that we can access and just do whatever we want with. What I want to do is I want to create a new converter, and to do that we call Goldmark.new. So I'm going to do this up. Well, I'll just do it down here so you can see it, and then we'll tweak from there. So we'll do Markdown renderer is going to be Goldmark.new, and then inside of here we can pass in some any options we have. So if we don't do any options, if we just leave it empty, and then down here we do Markdown renderer.convert, this ends up being exactly the same. Well, not exactly the same, but basically the same as what we had before. But if we were to change this so it has some options, then it's going to use this Markdown renderer to convert our Markdown into the HTML that we want. And it'll use those options every single time. So we're going to do with extensions, and then we're going to do highlighting dot highlight, and that's just the default highlighting extension. And did my imports? Oh, it's highlighting. Sorry, highlighting dot highlighting, which is just a great name, but whatever. So this is just the default, and this should give us syntax highlighting for our code using whatever all the defaults are. So let's go ahead and stop our server. Let's go run main.go and make sure this works. This one doesn't have any code, so let's go to one with code, and you'll see here that we now have syntax highlighting. We've got some red here. It's not like the most obvious in the world, but you know, it's definitely syntax highlighting. And if we want to do things like change this tab into 2 spaces when we're rendering it, rather than trying to update the markdown that we're getting, it would probably make more sense to use CSS to style that a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and just let that be for now. But if that's something that irks you, just keep that in mind as an option. Okay. So from here, I want to add a theme, and I don't really want the default theme. This isn't necessary. It's just like a little quirk of mine. And luckily, this highlighting package actually has a bunch of themes already built in. So I'm going to go ahead and change this. So instead of using highlighting, I'm going to do new highlighting. And then we're going to pass in some options. We're going to do highlighting.withStyle. And I'm not going to use GitHub. I'm going to use Dracula. So GitHub is another style that you can use, but Dracula is the one that I'm using in my editor right now. It's a theme that I just like to use for a lot of my coding. So I'm going to go ahead and just use that one for this blog that I'm building, because why not keep it consistent? So with this, we should be able to, again, stop the server, restart it, come back here, refresh, and you'll see that we now have that Dracula theme. And this is just one of the cool things about the, that Goldmark library, is that it has a lot of these things built into this extension so we can just use them. All right, last thing I'm going to do here. And this isn't entirely necessary. It's just kind of something that I want to do. Right now we're creating this markdown renderer using goldmark.new every single time we re-render that page, which realistically is not going to have a major impact on our performance, but realistically we don't need to do that. So we can go ahead and just delete this, and then we'll put this up here so that it gets rendered or gets created once, and then we're going to use it inside of this function as a closure. And as long as it is thread safe, which I believe it is, I haven't really dug into it. I'm going to hope it is and assume it is. And if not, I'll fix it later. But excuse me, this will just sort of allow us to not have to recreate that thing every single time. And we can just keep using the same one every single time we render HTML using Markdown. So let's go ahead and stop, restart, make sure this still works. That seems to work. This seems to work. All right, cool. You didn't see the pages really change. I was just refreshing them, making sure that I was not getting errors or anything else. All right, so this is all far from perfect, but a very good starting point. I think the last thing I want to go ahead and do is add a layout. And really what I want here is, if you see something like, if I go to my own blog at calhoun.io, you'll see here that there's some nav stuff you might have at the top. You might want to have links to courses or anything else that you have. I have like a free course like Go for Sizes. I've got like my web development course, and some other courses that are paid, free, whatever. So sometimes you want to have a nav page like this. And even if you are looking at one of these specific blog posts, you might want to render some of the stuff. And then when you get to the bottom of the blog post, you might want to see information about the author or something else. So if you want any of that type of thing, usually you need some sort of template or layout that you're pulling from. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to use Go's HTML/template library to create a post.go.html page that we can then render the contents of each blog post inside of. And long term, maybe I'll look at some other templating libraries, because there are a couple cool ones and it might be fun just to mess around with them. But for the time being, I don't think it makes sense to use a third-party library for what's probably going to be pretty basic needs. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the server and code post.go.html. And then inside of this, I think it's worth talking or thinking about what all we're going to have, and then we can try to use Copilot to generate some of this code for us. This is one of those cases where I think Copilot is fantastic for generating a bunch of boilerplate that we can then go modify, tweak, and make work for what we need. So I don't really want to bore you with writing a bunch of HTML that's just not super useful for us to learn from right now. So the first thing I know that I'm going to need in each single blog post is just the content of the blog post. So just your content of some sort. This is going to be whenever we take the Markdown and generate HTML, we're going to need that content to render somewhere. The second thing is we're probably going to have an author. Maybe we won't have multiple authors, but for now I'm going to assume that maybe that's a possibility. So I'm going to go ahead and generate the author with stuff coming from the server. And if it's always the same author, it doesn't really hurt us too much in the long run to do that. The third thing I'm going to assume that we're going to have as data that we can use is the toast, or the title of the post. And I want this as something separate, even though it's usually written as like the header inside of a blog post. The reason I want this separate is because you'll often want like a title tag inside of your HTML, something like this. I can't type today. Inside of this, and you'll want the title here. And you'll want that so that if somebody bookmarks the page or links it to somebody or whatever else, it actually shows the correct title for what the blog post is about. Okay. If that's the three things we're going to have, and then we need to decide how we're going to style everything. I personally prefer Tailwind CSS for pretty much all of my styling at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and include that. I'm going to do it via the CDN. So I'm not going to set up Tailwind just yet. Long term, that's definitely going to be the way we're going to want to go. But for short term, we can just use the CDN, get things working, make sure that it's showing up the pages. And then when we go to deploy things and actually release this, if I do at least, I can get rid of the CDN and generate Tailwind and minify everything so that it works a lot better. I also know from the past that I'm going to be using Tailwind's typography plugin. This is, let me go ahead and just grab it. So if you've never seen it, Tailwind CSS is just a way to build or style your HTML. And it's just, I find it to be very useful. And then the other thing is the typography plugin, which is a plugin for Tailwind CSS. The main goal of this is to take generated HTML. So something like our Markdown being generated into HTML or any other generated HTML that you're going to have. It's great for taking that HTML and styling it. And it does that by looking for this pros class and then any HTML inside of this, inside of an item with that pros class. All of this HTML is going to be styled automatically, even without Tailwind classes. So it just makes it nice because you can't really tell anything like this gold mark library to add Tailwind classes. I mean, maybe you can with the extensions, I don't know. But it's a lot easier just to use this plugin and make it work. Okay, so putting this all together, I'm going to try to tell Tailwind what I want. We're going to generate, I'm going to say generate an HTML template that uses Tailwind CSS via, I don't want via, I'm pretty sure if I tried this last time, it didn't work the way I wanted. So we're going to use this Tailwind CSS plus the typography plugin and renders a blog post with a title, author, and content using Go template syntax. It should also have a nav bar with links to the home, about, and contact pages. So let's see what we get here. Chances are I'm going to have to tweak this, and I'm completely fine with that. I'm just hoping it gives me a decent starting point. I'm just going to accept it because what I saw looks reasonable. Okay, so first we have the head, and inside of here we have the just the meta stuff that I'm going to ignore. We have the title, and that is using the title that I expected with the HTML or the syntax I want. The one thing this is getting wrong is this here CDN. It's probably not entirely wrong. We can just go ahead and leave it there and try. But I know from experience that Tailwind's newest CDN uses a script tag. So I actually have it pulled up here. It uses a script tag because this allows us to, or at least this version I want uses a script tag, because this allows us to pull plugins. And it does this by making sure that the JavaScript can figure out which plugins we want and can pull everything in correctly. It can also use like a custom config and some other stuff. So it's really kind of cool how much customization you can do with their CDN. But again, not really what we want long term. But so we'll tweak this here in a second. But I'll just leave it be for now. I don't think I'm going to want this either. But actually, let's just go ahead and fix these because I know they're not what I'm going to want long term. So what I want instead of this is just this script tag that's going to read https cdn.tailwindcss.com plugins typography. Okay, so now we come down here to the body. This is setting the body to be BG gray, a bunch of other stuff. I'm just going to ignore. I'm just like sort of skimming this. We'll have a home page, an about page, contact page. Then we come down here and it's going to have a title, an author, and it's going to have the content. That all looks perfectly fine to me. If I need to tweak it, I can, but that'll be fine for a starting point. So from here, I want to go ahead and update my post handler to use this here HTML template I have. So I'm going to go back to my main.go. And in here, I want to parse this template. And then once I parse it, I want to use it to render instead of just copying everything over. So I'm going to go ahead and start right here, and I'm just going to see how this goes. We'll do TPL, error is going to be template.parse files, post.go HTML. And then we'll say if error is equal to nil. I guess I'll panic for now. That's fine. I'll fix it later. let's go ahead and change that actually. Let's do http.error, error parsing template, return. And then here we're going to say error is going to be equal to tpl.execute. And then I need data. Okay, so I didn't define data yet. We talked about this and we actually used it inside of this. So we need a title, an author, and content. I think these are all going to be strings for now. That might change later, but for now I think it makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and just say type post data struct. And then we will make this be content, author, string, title, string. And then I'll come back down here and we're going to make this post data. And we'll do content is going to be my buffer converted into a string. And then author is going to be John Calhoun. And title is just going to be my blog. That's fine. Eventually I'll get the title and I'll parse it from either metadata or from the slug or something. Probably metadata. But for now, I think it's fine just to hard code it. Then here we're going to say if error is not equal to nil, error executing template, return. And this is where having Copilot to just do the really basic stuff for me is kind of nice. All right, so we have this doing everything we'd expect. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure this works, and then I'm going to talk about some changes we could make here to, make this a little bit better. All right, refreshing this. It definitely looks better. The one thing I will note here is that you're seeing that the title and the author happen, and then there's another what looks like a title. So what's going on here is this is the title that I'm providing via the post data struct. And then this title here is actually coming from my Markdown. So you'll see here in the Markdown, I have a single asterisk, and this is what's being used to generate that title. So this is something I see with a lot of blogging platforms. What typically happens is that people will just start exempting this and they'll start having metadata that's shown above each blog post. And the metadata will have things like the title, the author, the publication date, and anything else they want there. And they'll just not have this here. So that's probably how we're going to handle this long term. But for now, I think we can just kind of let it be and ignore it and just know it's going to be something we'll tweak later. But you'll see here that the rest of this actually looks pretty decent. These links aren't going to work. That's fine. Not really worried about that. But as far as like just getting things together and throwing it on a page real quick, this looks like a decent blog post. I'm obviously zoomed in. This is what the normal script size would look like. But, it doesn't look too bad. So yeah, before I end this, the last thing I want to look at is inside of main.go, and that is this template stuff. And specifically this bit here. You'll see here that I am parsing this template every single time we reload this page. And that could be good, I guess. I could put blah here, and then I can come back here and reload. You'll see the blah now shows up. But in reality, when we deploy to production, we're not going to be changing this here template ever without doing a new deploy. So having that doesn't really help us. And if anything, it just kind of slows us down. It means we have to read this file from disk every single time somebody visits this page, which is not really the best way to spend our time. So what I like to do is to parse my template files sometime prior to the actual HTTP handler executing. That way I can, make sure it's all working. And oftentimes I'll actually have my server stop deploying stop running if it tries to parse files for templates and then those files don't parse correctly, because to me that means there's a developer bug of some sort, like a developer made a mistake and that should not have been a valid deploy. So what I'm going to do to make this work is I'm going to take this part where we parse the template, I'm going to delete it out of here, and I'm going to put it up here before our function that we're returning. So I'm going to put it before this HTTP handler function closure that we have. And basically I'm going to say that if this template doesn't parse, I need to return some sort of error. So for me to do that, I need to change this function so it now returns a handler function and an error. And then here I'm going to say if there's an error, return nil, error. Or we could do fump.errorf, error parsing templates, and return that. That does mean that down here we'll return the function. We now need to change this so it returns both the function and nil, because it doesn't have any errors if it gets to this point and it's returning the function. This might be a little confusing for anybody this is new to. I could have done all of this parsing inside of, actually, that probably makes more sense. Let's just go ahead and do that. I was trying to show this just so you could see what it was like, but I don't think this makes sense. I think what makes more sense is to say TPL, and this will be a template.template. It needs to be a pointer though. And then this is going to return just an http.handler func, and it's going to assume that you're passing in a template. So let's get rid of that template part, get rid of this extra no part. And you'll see here that I'm still using TPL. So I'm using the template that gets passed in, but I just know that it's already parsed by the time we get in here. And then if I go up to my main.go, inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and parse this template. And you'll see that there actually is a must parsed file, or sorry, it's a must. Then we can do template.parseFiles. And then I can get rid of this error part. I'm probably gonna get mixed feedback on this one, but I will explain it here in a second. Okay, so here what I'm doing is I'm saying template.must, which is a function that expects a template is the first argument and an error is the second argument. And if there is an error, it's going to panic. Otherwise, it's just going to return the template. So this is just kind of a little helper function that allows us to not ignore error handling, but basically say, if there is an error, I want you to panic. And I'm doing that because we are inside of the main function. And I'm assuming that if this code happens to have an error and you can't parse this, I just want it to panic right now because I don't even want my code to try to start. People have different opinions about that. Some people think that you should handle these errors explicitly. And most of the time I would agree. This just happens to be one of those rare exceptions where I'm completely fine with my code panicking and not even starting if it can't parse a template file. And then once we have this template, I can pass it in here, and I probably should rename this to be like post template and then make sure I'm passing the correct one in here. All right, and that should be there. So now if I go run main.go, the code will work. We'll see this is still being rendered fine, but you'll notice that if I come back here and type in, this is something new, come back here and refresh, this doesn't change. And the reason that doesn't change is because it's already parsed that template once and it's not going to reparse it over and over again. It just does it once and then keeps it in memory. All right, so there's a lot of other things we can do here. We could actually add the things like the author and the title, which I'm probably going to do with metadata. We could fix things so that we either strip out this initial title so we don't have title twice, or we could figure out some way to handle it. We could make the links in the navbar work. I'm not going to worry about any of that right now. I think this is a good stopping point. We've got blog posts that look reasonably decent, even if we don't have a way of viewing all of our blog pages or anything like that. This is a good starting point to making our blog posts look decent. And that was really all my goal was for this video. If you enjoyed this, please definitely consider subscribing, but also I create a bunch of courses. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. You might want to check them out just to see if they make sense for you. Go for Sizes is probably the most common one. It's a free coding exercises course where I basically have 15 to 20 exercises that are all shorter than this Build a Blog series. And you basically just build different things and learn things about Go as you do it. I've also got at usegolang.com, I have this web development with Go course, and this is my most popular paid course where we actually go through the whole process of building a real production grade web application from the ground up. And it's a very long course. There's a lot to get into. And it tries to teach everything so that if you go try to get a job as a developer or anything else, that you have all those foundational pieces of information you need so that you can do really well at that. There's also some samples for that one. So if you don't really know what that's like, or you just want to see the samples to see what web development in Go might look like, definitely check those out. It's completely free to get the samples, and you can just see if it makes sense for you. Thanks so much for checking this out.